I think I was born yesterday. I know all the tricks.
Oh, wow. One day we might actually eat some decent food, Steve, might
But we do normally. One has to maintain one's gut, otherwise you lose it.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Jung To Live By, the premier online outlet for depth psychology resources, giving you all the tools that you need to individuate properly, or in other words, become who you are. And thank you for joining myself and Steve and Pauline Richards for the third episode of our series Ask a Depth Psychologist, where people at the $10 tier or higher on Patreon can submit questions for us to dig into and expand upon. And basically it's a way of giving back to the community for us to become a family together. But first of all, Steve, Pauline, how are you today?
Hi, James.
Hi James, hi everyone.
Brilliant. Let's crack straight on into the questions then. We have 9 questions today, and the first one comes from Lao Tsunami, which is a fantastic name, I must say. And he asks, is the Animus related to the paternal spirit of culture, Osiris? If so, can trauma to the Animus disrupt a woman's ability to integrate herself into culture and cause a feeling of alienation? What can be done about it? What do you think? Does Osiris play a role in people's lives?
Well, it would if you were Tutankhamun, perhaps. I'm not being facetious when I say that, because the image that you choose to illustrate a fundamental dynamic will colour how you interpret that dynamic. So although I take it in general terms, Osiris, it's not relevant to somebody who is not into Egyptian mythology or Egyptian culture. So I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the Animus, Paul?
What I probably would say is that I'm thinking about some of the friends that we have as well. We found an awful lot of women are into Egyptian culture and probably don't know why.
That's true.
Yeah, I did have a dream recently. I've told you two about it, but it was kind of just an illustration of the collective unconscious that I did appear. It was a very alchemical dream, as you guys know, but when randomly the backdrop changed from being in a restaurant to being like deep in an Egyptian temple with all these hieroglyphs on the walls and everything else. And I've never had an interest in Egyptian culture. Like, it just hasn't resonated with me particularly. I've quite liked Greek culture, obviously loved Old English culture, War of the Roses, that kind of stuff. It never really kind of stuck. But that was one thing actually that put me off of Jung in the very, very beginning. Was he's very much the way his work is presented a lot of the time is here are loads of different myths and here's what they mean. But as you two were saying, it's like you don't need the particular character to focus on. If Osiris doesn't resonate with you, it doesn't matter. If God the Father doesn't resonate, it doesn't matter. If in general, to be completely honest, the resultant images from your own dreams is probably the best way of getting into this stuff rather than jumping into the myths. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's completely different when something Egyptian turns up spontaneously in a dream or a related state to you just, for example, appropriating that to illustrate a point in an abstract way.
Yes.
So if somebody dreams of an Egyptian dream, that's immediately interesting because it's a fact that's been delivered directly from the unconscious and it has to be taken seriously. Pauline's right. I can think of several.
Yes.
In fact, and I'm running out of being able to count how many women that we've known over the years, socially and in terms of being clients or patients, who have had a fascination with Egypt. That said, very few of them were very conscious.
Yes.
And that made me wonder, and still does, just what the point of the symbol, the attraction to that symbol was for them. It may well be rather like the Rosetta Stone, which we used to keep when we were in the NHS regularly. We actually had it.
Have you still got the Rosetta Stone thing behind you?
Yes, it is.
On the end there, yeah.
Yeah, because you were showing me this the other day. It was quite cool.
It's just a model. Rather like Sigmund Freud had all sorts of gods and goddesses up on his table of his consulting room. We had the same kind of thing, and this is one which we found particularly useful. It's in 3 languages, and this is the stone, the original, which allowed the translation of hieroglyphs for the very first time. A French linguist, Jean-Paul Champollion, and one of the languages is Greek. And then the middle language is a cursive form of Demotic, which was partially understood. And then there was hieroglyphs, completely misunderstood, unknown. So we use that as a metaphor for consciousness, Greek, the language of science and philosophy, the known language. The cursive demotic script is that hinterland of the psyche, the background, where all the symbols start to emerge from the unconscious and take a definite form so that they can communicate to consciousness. And the hieroglyphs themselves, being the unknown language, is the language of the unconscious. But the usefulness of this as a symbol was that this message here is the same message written in 3 different languages. So the communication from the unconscious in its own terms passes through a transitional layer whereby it can communicate directly to ego consciousness, but still in symbolic form. And then it emerges into consciousness in the language of everyday life, the educated language, symbolically Greek for our culture. So in that sense, this was not so much a symbol, more of a metaphor, perhaps, but a very, very useful one. And going back to what I said, some of these women who are into ancient Egyptian culture to the point where they collect symbols and feel very attached and attracted to them, but have no conscious relationship to an understanding of them, apart, say, from watching the History Channel on TV or buying a few books, but they don't integrate that fully. Well, they're in a stasis because they're not relating at all to the unconscious. The unconscious is still communicating, but they're not doing anything about it other than relating externally, still in an unconscious way. So you then get a cycle where this attraction to the Egyptian culture is still there because it's not being resolved. This is what Freud called, for example, repetition compulsion. Until you know what's coming through, it will keep coming until you can make that translation. So for people that we were working with, we would often say that your unknown story at the moment is written in the language of the hieroglyphs, and we don't know what it is. But by the time it becomes a cursive demotic communication, we have some understanding of what it is. By the time then we can get it into consciousness, fully translated as one message, you will have integrated what you need to integrate, and the job is done.
So is that what the attraction to the Egyptian symbols and whatever else was?
Yeah.
Is that what it meant, basically? Is that you have the hieroglyphs and the psyche is almost going, I'm trying to give you a message, and it's not being brought to consciousness? Or was it something in particular, like they were attracted to, say, an animus symbol within it for some particular reason? Basically, what were the commonalities between those patients?
Well, the thing is that for people who are attracted to Egypt, it's rather, this is my interpretation, and it's based not simply on articulating ideas or colliding them, it's based on clinical experience. That, as Jung said, that if a Westerner in his day were to dream or to access symbols from the Far East, from China, he's pretty much at the bottom of the psyche. I think it's similar with Egypt. Egypt is a kind of hinterland for Western culture. In many ways, they were precursors to the Greeks. There was a lot of communication with Greece, even in the Bronze Age, in the Mycenaean Age, and probably before that. So Egypt helped to seed Greece, but it is very, very different as a baseline culture. There was a lot of communication later, obviously, during Alexander the Great's period, the Hellenistic period. The Ptolemies, of whom Cleopatra was the last example, was a Macedonian by descent. In fact, she was an inbred Macedonian, and she was not an ethnic Egyptian at all. And Egyptian culture at that time was a pure syncretism between Greece and Egypt. But if you go that far back, that the two are completely separated with respect to our consciousness, you have that gap, that chasm. And you see it an awful lot with women these days. And that's left us to consider whether or not, as Jung said about China, that you're getting deep into the bottom of what is not known and not articulated for people who are, animated, if you like, by Egyptian culture and symbols.
So if a woman's psyche selects a symbol like that, it suggests a degree of unconsciousness, doesn't it?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, just how removed from consciousness it is.
Exactly, simply stated, and sorry about the over-explanation.
No. So I'm just trying to relate this back to myself for a second. So the fact that I had, without any previous, I learned it in school, maybe for like a day, without any previous connection, the fact I'm now in an Egyptian temple, could you then put that same diagnosis, Pauline, onto me and be like, there's something deeply unconscious here?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah. Would you?
Yeah, I would. I'd have a lot of caveats about that.
Yeah.
because there's the context.
Yeah.
The context is you, and beyond you, the people you know, and where you are right now. And this is why, and I've said it on the Discord, that I avoid doing dream analysis on the Discord. It's an easy thing to do because to do a dream analysis, because all you're really doing is just putting your own thoughts, ideas, and immediate projections into material presented by someone else. And that is fallacy 101 when you work clinically with someone else and their dreams, and also with your own. It's an over-amplification away from the material based on your own associations. So before I'd be too prescriptive about interpreting that symbolism, I'd want to know a lot more about you. But if I can, what I would say by way of further illustration is the little I do know about you and about your context, then I would at least suspect that the Egyptian symbolism has to do with your anima.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense with the rest of the dream as well, as I'm sure I've told you before.
It makes sense in the context of everything else that you're doing. But I would rather not be too specific about that. I'd want to understand the background of the message. I'd want to know what that message was and how we could translate it from the Egyptian hieroglyphs into something you could be more conscious of. And that's the metaphor again of the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah, I think getting people to do that is the most difficult bit, isn't it, really? Because you would have to be encouraged to amplify or to associate to that material yourself. As I think Steve was saying, rather than having a therapist impose some kind of explanation on it for you. So, yeah.
Now, just by way of a caveat with respect to what I've just said, I'm not trying to put people off interpreting dreams, because if you want to become effective at doing that, you have to start somewhere. The psyche, if you're wrong, will do one of two things. It will ignore you, which is healthy, obviously, or two, it will produce some kind of counter reaction to what you've suggested by way of an interpretation for a third party. That can be a constructive reaction from the psyche, or it can be its opposite, a destructive one. And that's where the risks come in. Generally, if you're wrong, it'll ignore you and just perhaps send another dream. They're a bit like buses. There's always going to be another one along. So don't worry too much. If you do attempt to interpret someone else's dreams, and of course your own, and you get it wrong, psyche wants you to be well. It wants to balance things out. But at the same time, don't prematurely think that you understand what you're saying.
Yes.
Give it time. Because very often, as Jung himself says, it's a dream series which reveals things. Occasionally you get a big dream, which really stands out. But again, we have to be careful about misinterpreting that. And again, Jung was very, very fond of referring back to the Greek oracles. And there's one, which I think it was King Croesus of Lydia, consulted an oracle, and he wanted to know, should he cross a certain river in order to attack his enemy? And the reply was from the Delphic oracle, if King Croesus crosses the river, a great empire will be destroyed. So he did, and his own was destroyed. You have to be careful.
You do.
Yeah.
But with that caveat in mind, go ahead, because there's no other way of gaining experience than the gaining of it. And if you're sincere in your heart, then the psyche will forgive you.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to have patients come in, and they'd come in with 5 or 6 dreams, wouldn't they, typically? Well, for you it seems particularly. And they just kind of like plop them down on the table and expect you to just go through everything and say what everything meant and how it all linked up together.
Part of the transference.
Yeah, very much so. And I think the thrust of a lot of what we're doing here is to encourage people to do it for themselves, obviously with some guidance, with some help. There's always resistance to that because of the transference, people want you to do it for them. But the more that you can associate on your own material, the better. And then, if you've got somebody close to you, a partner who's involved in what you're doing, or a therapist, to work that through between you. But it shouldn't just be a case of, what does this mean? What does that mean? And so on. And like Steve says, it's got to be context specific anyway. But the more you can do, the more you try yourself, the better.
Absolutely. If somebody comes in and presents a dream, and they have their own interpretation of it, of course I listen to it, but I try and look around it all the time. I look at the person who's telling me this? What is their context, and what is standing behind them? In other words, the hieroglyph level of explanation, if you like, that's pushing these symbols through into consciousness for them, and is looking to see how the patient, client, and say myself will interact and interpret the material, because it's watching me or Pauline or whoever the therapist is as closely as it watches the personality of the dreamer. So it's a big picture, and sometimes what appears on the surface as a dream is literally just the tip of the iceberg. And that's really what makes it interesting, is that alchemical process of relationship with another human being and how you work with that. Sometimes if you ignore a dream deliberately on an intuition that somebody brings in, you'll get a very strong reaction from the psyche. But that's just a hypothesis that you test at the time and saying, well, I'm not really sure what this is, so I'm going to ignore it and see what happens. And then you'll get a little indicator of where you might be going wrong.
Yeah, I think it's good. Sorry, Jen, I was just going to say, it's probably good to try and get to a point where, if you say in a clinical situation, you're working with someone where you have an agreement almost between yourselves that if you offer something and it's not right, that the patient, the person says, well, no, that doesn't fit, that doesn't feel right. I mean, we do that for one another, don't we, as much as we can. And some things hit home, as you'd expect. And it's like, like a light going on, and other things you just think, no, it's just kind of skimming off, and it just doesn't feel right at all. So I think to have that openness and to just allow things to unfold is probably very important. Yeah,
I know from my own long experience with Pauline, because say for 40 years we've been working on each other's dreams, that early on my intuition got ahead of itself. And because intuition is a very persuasive thing, you can also suggest to yourself that you understand something when you don't. And this is where you have to be careful. And in those early days, I would probably come out with something and trust my intuition too much. And then it would turn out you were completely wrong, but you were so convinced by your typology, by your extroverted intuition. So I thought, I've got to change this. I've got to be flexible enough to change that, which means my ego position, my consciousness has to change and has to adapt. And that was a gradual process.
It's a good point to raise, really, because intuition is so good at making connections between things. I mean, you got to a point, like you say, you were so good at it, you could probably just almost straight away form those connections, say between a dream series, and offer an explanation for what it all might mean in a kind of neat package. And sometimes you'd be bang on.
Sometimes,
but you do have to at least be aware of it.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and in the end, the process of analysis and its apparent success, because you seem to be hitting the mark, it becomes more important than the phenomenon itself. And of course, over the decades, you learn to change that. And particularly when someone starts analysing your dreams with a different style, and then you see it's possible to be done in a different way. And then when you expand out your work, so you're working with other people and their dreams, that changes everything. So that's why I'm reticent to interpret dreams, except in the most superficial of ways, unless I know something about the background of the person.
And when it comes to your own dreams, the background of yourself. So when you were speaking there about making mistakes in dream reading, dream interpretation even, I've been collecting my dreams for about 18 months now. Every night if I can remember them. And the more I'm engaged, the more I'll remember them, and the more dreams I seem to actually have.
Definitely.
Seems to be the psyche sort of allowing it, right?
That's very true.
But I realized, looking back over my, I had this nice spreadsheet up. It was like dream meta-analysis, and I was just going through very, very TI mode, very, very well, this symbol means anima, this symbol means this. Not really knowing what the things really meant. But the key thing which helped me was realizing dreams compensate for things. They don't tell you things, usually, that you already know on the surface.
Compensate or complement, so
So my dreams at the time, I was like, well, I guess I need to work harder. That was the interpretation. when really I didn't need to work harder. It was the complete opposite. And work harder or get up on time. There'd be things involving time, and I'd be like, well, obviously I'm not using my time more effectively. It was just reasserting my own current ego attitude. But no, looking back on them, they all were formed this weird recurring dream sequence, which meant something completely different to what I originally did.
There's not enough emphasis on personal associations usually, and I think that's the best place to start, because if you get caught up in all the archetypal stuff, it can just be besides the point, for the reasons that we've been discussing over and over again in the podcast, really, that it doesn't bring you any closer to your own personal myth. So that's the place to start, is your own personal associations to the content.
And get rid of all dream books along the way as well. Put them
definitely.
Put them in a fire, burn them away.
Without a doubt,
definitely. Well, we've
talked about complementarity that Pauline raised. Compensation is obviously the basic idea of homeostasis and balance, but complementarity is often overlooked. Sometimes the attitude of consciousness is right, and the dream complements, adds to that, and offers an extension of that. But you never know. You never really, really know in the moment. You have to look back and see what the trend is, and then adjust accordingly.
Certainly. Well, I think we've got a little bit, and it's all good. We got a little bit sidetracked off of Lau's question, because the second half of Lau's question is about. So he's talking about, is the animus related to the paternal spirit of culture, which would be Osiris? But he again goes on and asks, can trauma to the animus disrupt a woman's ability to integrate herself into culture and cause a feeling of alienation? And if so, what can be done about it?
Yeah, I would say so.
Yes,
Yes,
it is. I think without a doubt. I'm just reminded too of a Jungian analyst called John Destian's work as well. I think you're familiar with his book, James, Coming Together, Coming Apart. And he introduces a couple of concepts which might be useful here, and he talks about the idea of the prevailing spirit, which is the spirit of the culture, and a woman's own essential spirit, and the kind of the collision of the two. And I guess, again, the more a woman is developed on the inside, the more she can resist pressures from the culture that might have a negative influence on her. So I think it's just quite a simple but useful distinction to make between those two things. Otherwise, there is no separation. There is no consciousness of those two things being different from one another. And of course, with all these things, they feed in. So yeah, I think if a woman thinks in those terms and she develops herself on the inside, it will be easier to resist some of those forces, particularly if they're in a negative form.
Yeah, definitely. It reminded me from that book. I was reading it last night, actually, and when you mentioned Lau about alienation, the guy who wrote the book, he talks about infatuation, and when this is the same for a man with his anima, but say a woman becomes infatuated with a man, she'll project her animus onto this man, and in the process he talks about you feel like you're alive. So it's like all of your senses become activated. It's just that feeling of being alive. But of course, in that happens, the ego is being bombarded with unconscious contents, basically. So in terms of alienation, if you have got some strong animus activation in whatever sense, possession, projection, anything like that, then there will be a sense of alienation, especially if it's projected onto somebody else and the love or the infatuation isn't returned. I imagine that's probably a case of alienated.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think that answers that first question. Thank you, Lau. Lau's asked two.
Thank you.
He's also asked two more questions, though. And he asks, how do people relate to the same-sex energy? For men, is the animus the senex, or is that a different thing?
Well, I'll say it was a different thing. Senex in Jungian circles is usually used pejoratively to represent someone who is either elderly or older and has fossilized, become concrete, or to a young person who is prematurely aged psychologically, or perhaps got beyond themselves and assumed something say, wisdom beyond their years, and it's actually paralyzing and crippling because they lose their energy for adaptation to the first half of life by acting as if they're in the second half of life, and they're not. So you can have a Senex in their 20s easily. It's more appropriate to be a Senex when you're older, but it's still not good necessarily to start to turn into a fossil and to stop living when you're older too. So there is a Senex pathology. So yeah, that would be different. That's a different thing.
So when you're a young man, be a young man, basically allow your lifespan to unfold, essentially.
Yes,
that's the task of.
It's absolutely right to do that. No.
It's the task of the first half of life if we follow Jung. On that. Of course, some people though will individuate more quickly and also differently in a qualitative sense, and will bring in positive Senex elements into their life when they're younger. The proof of it is in the result. Does this allow a person to adapt more productively, or is it actually fueling or just representing a neurosis? And that's a question for an individual to ask of themselves.
Yes, it's when this type of individual perhaps gets more socially withdrawn and is like, I have my wisdom, I am bearing my wisdom. The world does not understand my wisdom. I'm born in the wrong generation. This type of thing, I imagine, is kind of the thought process.
And sometimes with people who say those kinds of things when they're young, they actually do have a huge amount of potential, but something has blocked it. So the way around it is to fantasize about being older than they are.
Yeah.
You will get this, for example, with young people who speak as if they've lived for 1,000 years, and they've had experience greater than anybody, and they carry that kind of wisdom. And what's behind that very often is that they have more life ahead of them than they do behind them. So in effect, they know that all experience that's worth having has been had before they were even born. So let's learn from the past. That would be the positive way of looking at it. Yes. But then if you bring the past forward as if you knew these people, if you knew Nietzsche, as some people do at the moment on the internet, they talk about Nietzsche as if he was a best friend or something, and then handed down some form of psychotherapy to him, and Nietzsche wasn't even into psychotherapy, or any of those philosophers or great thinkers from the past. They're acquiring something. They're acquiring by proxy a reference to knowledge and wisdom they simply cannot have, and they're failing to be young people. They're failing to live according to their lifespan development program. The Senex will come later. Give it time. Be who you should be at that time and at that moment. So young people very often will look to the past because they have a future. The future's sorted. They believe that they'll go there, but they have no past. They have no experience. But with old people, they have no future, and they look to the past in a different way, which causes them to look forward into a fantasy, imagined future of what it would be like for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. If only their life could extend that far forward, then what they've learned through their timeline and through their learning of previous generations' timeline, they could take that wisdom forward. Or they become Senexes and they become fossilized and unable to relate to young people and to pass on the wisdom of experience of their own generation and what they've acquired from the generations past. So you have a puer pathology and a Senex pathology, and they're both actually opposite sides of the same coin.
Gotcha.
I think it can be a compensation too for parents' lack of development sometimes
Great
as
point.
well.
Great point. Yeah.
And if you've got a mum and dad who maybe are puers and puellas themselves, then what else can you do but look to the past to gain the wisdom that you need to go into the future and to develop yourself? I mean, if it's not there within the context of your family, it's difficult, isn't it?
Parents who are still children.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
How can they raise children if they're still children?
Yes. Yeah.
And if their development is arrested?
Yeah.
Then the example they're giving of wisdom is to be an eternal child.
Yeah.
That's dangerous.
It is. I mean, if you get such notions, certainly in women's psychology, such as the unmothered mother, the mother who is biologically able to have a child and has a child, but because she hasn't been mothered properly herself, then that mother child relationship gets off to a difficult start. And like Steve, I think, is suggesting, well, where do you go then? Where do you go for, who do you look to model what you should be doing?
Yeah.
And you see it a lot
Really
in the
good
culture
point.
where mothers and daughters are more like sisters. For example, the mothers and daughters, they dress the same, they go out to clubs together, etc., etc. And you see the lack of maturity in the mother, and sometimes, you know, more maturity in the daughter, but nonetheless they're kind of caught in this trap where neither really can develop properly. So it's probably just something else to look out for.
Yeah, I agree, and that's a really good point, because it highlights why young people very often project onto these big collective personalities, who might be heading up a cultural movement at the moment. Say if it's a bloke or a man, then he will get a father transference essentially, and a projection of the unactualized father archetype,
it's got to go somewhere,
which is powered by the instincts that young person has to actualize themselves in relationship to a significant male other who will initiate them and bring them through various transformations, lifespan development transformations. If they're lucky, they'll project onto the right person. If they're not, then that person will become a Pied Piper and will lead them over the cliff into the abyss. So beware of these people. Keep your discrimination properly engaged.
Keep it honed.
Yeah, this is what I was talking to a guy it was a Therian actually, whose question is going to be coming out very, very soon, about trusting your own psychobiological instinct, essentially. Because at university, from basically day one, I decided to take on myself, based on past trauma with an ex-girlfriend. I decided to basically be a dad, not to other people, but to be a mature, responsible person and whatever else. And of course, I've slipped up and whatever else. But at university, I didn't have the university experience, if you like, for as degenerate as it might be, you know, partying and drinking and generally being social. I didn't have that at university, right? Then I go on my master's degree. I turn up to Canterbury, and to me, in my mind, Canterbury with the cathedral and the old English architecture, it's like an image of the kingdom of God to me. It's a wonderful thing, and I only figured out recently why that was and why I'm so desperate to go back, and it's because I was free there. I was absolutely free from any kind of, we'll say, parental introject, any kind of external or internal obligation. I had sort of like the world mapped out in front of me, and I could actually explore and engage with my own personal myth, my own personal path, for the first time in forever. So I guess to sort of give the young person's perspective on this, the idea is not necessarily you have to abandon wisdom and abandon trying to improve yourself and instead just be a young person. It's simply engage on the journey, I guess, and to focus on your own personal myth rather than skipping to the end. Because that's what I tried to do, and then I ended up being like, why am I desperate to go back to the place in which I was free, where every single Thursday they would have really, really cheap high percent beer, and I was drawn to go there with my friends, and it was great fun, and I was actually enjoying myself, letting those lofty ideas of responsibility and bear wisdom and pass the torch. So I've got time for that when I'm 35, 40. For now, relax, be free, right?
Definitely.
Yes.
Sweet. Well, we have a
very good point.
Cool. We got a third question here from Lao Tsunami, and he asks: are people's relationship with their fathers related to how they relate to the divine? Like in Christianity, it talks about the Heavenly Father. Is this an Animus projection?
Well, it would be for a female, wouldn't it? Potentially, if she was part of, say, Christianity or Judaism or Islam or anything which has a monotheistic paternal deity, that will draw that out. Freud, for example, Jewish, not Christian. He was also very much a rationalist and a Darwinian, fundamentally. Said that, this is a paraphrase, but more or less accurate, that psychoanalysis concludes that the father and God really are the same thing. From the perspective of the child in the cradle, when he looks up at his father, in effect, that is God. And that was more or less his position. Very different from Jung, of course, because Jung wanted to see it as an active dynamic within the psyche, and looked into the religious function, as he called it, in a positive sense. Freud was more of a rationalist and a materialist and a Darwinist, and wanted to separate things off as he saw it properly. And he thought that people should be neurotic for proper reasons, individual reasons, rather than adopt what he called a collective neurosis. And that was his version of the interpretation of religion. Quite dark, quite negative. But yes, fundamentally, it depends on your starting point, where you're coming from, how your psyche has stacked itself up over your lifespan developments in coordination with your culture and your learning. That will produce the representations that are projected symbolically out onto other people and into the culture, and then what you bounce back through introjection into your psyche with a sympathetic resonance. So yeah, it can be, absolutely, no doubt. But you know, in broad terms, who are we talking about? Are we talking about someone who follows a monotheistic faith, or are we talking about a Hindu, or are we talking about perhaps someone from China, where female deity is quite common, you know, and the connection to them? So again, context is everything, but it's a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to bring in the idea of context as well, actually, because, you know, take, say, the Gospels. From Jesus's perspective, God would represent something else, or Heavenly Father, potentially, in, say, Mary Magdalene would. And then in the same case, because religion is such a... it's difficult to be analytical and go like, well, Jesus was this archetype or this symbol or this image, for example, because you're actually in the religion and it becomes something real for you and you engage with it. So it's like for each different person, it would be a different thing. And I think we discussed before, in terms of an archetype being a whole situation and not a particular character, all of that, of course, becomes relevant in this context. I mean, so to allow, I guess, if you're a religious person, it would be something personal to you rather than looking to the text and top down going into it and saying like, well, this must mean it's this archetype. It's like, what does it feel? What emotions does it bring up for you?
Yeah, the crucifixion is in a context, and the meaning that the Christians ascribe to that is the whole thing. It's not just the act of that, although people treat it as if it were. If you simply have the image of the hanged man, that is an image which appears in all sorts of contexts. They're all related contexts, though, but they're not related on the surface. They're related at deep structure. On the surface structure, there's all the variations between the various forms that the hanged man image has taken. But for a Christian, the archetype is the story, and it begins in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament gives the New Testament meaning. Yes. The difference between the two is a continuity of meaning that without the Old Testament, the New Testament means nothing at all. So it's the whole life of Christ as believed in by Christians that is the archetype, which summates in the resurrection, even more than the crucifixion itself. So don't abstract things out from it. You'll just tie yourself up in knots. If you want to understand that, look at the whole context.
Yeah, beginning with, in this particular case, Adam and Eve. Adam taking the apple. This was Aquinas' thing, I believe.
All of it, yeah.
Adam taking the apple off the tree, and then Christ being hung back on the tree to atone for the initial mistake. So yeah, and it's, but in that particular instance, it becomes more difficult because then, in its traditional religious sense, you can't really go and you can't just pick out something from the gospel and read it you can, in a depth psychology sense, pick something out and give a reading and be like, well, this is the moral of the story. Because that's kind of like a shallow thing, and our audience does tend to be very intelligent people who kind of get it. Yeah. They really get it. And it's like, well, it's no wonder you can't turn to something like that. You know, not to take away from that, but it's like you'll be after something deeper in what things are trying to understand.
It's the opportunity for the abuse of power once you abstract things out of their context and weaponize them. And you do see this in religious people, so-called, who want to control others, you know, and want to punish them and want to harm and hurt them. This is the dark side of that religion. Mm-hmm. As you can experience it in everyday life. Look at it in its totality, as you should a dream. Don't abstract things out from a dream. What does the dream say? Not what do we say about it. You know, what does the dream itself say? What's the fabric of it? What's the lighting like in a dream? That part, the background. All of that, the shades of colour, the transitions, everything means something. If you just focus on the characters, you're not understanding the context. You really do have to see everything to understand the dream. And something as big as that, which you've just been discussing, you need to see the whole picture. Yeah. Someone who wants to abuse you or influence you will abstract something out and weaponize it. Yeah. And it's the same with therapists, believe it or not. They do it all the time because there's a lot of power that goes on in the helping professions. Be very careful.
Okay. Well, we have. Go ahead, Pauline.
I was just going to add a little bit to that, because sort of coming back to the actual beginning of the question. I think because we know quite a few women who are Christian women who are religious in that way. And they do literally give their animus in that spiritual form over to God, and in doing so they give up their own, in essence, their own power over themselves, and obviously in a negative form, they'll use that to abuse themselves, or as I think Steve was suggesting, they project it out and they sadly abuse others with it. So yes, I think that can happen, but again, it tends to happen in people who are very unconscious. Women who are very unconscious, and they allow it literally to run their lives, to direct their lives for them. So they kind of give themselves over implicitly to this higher authority, which will answer all the questions that they have for them, and in doing so they give up their own strength, their own feminine power, really.
So that's power of the word then, isn't it?
It's power of the word again, without a doubt. Absolutely it is. I mean, we've seen it so many times, even within our own families. If you don't mind me mentioning, say your mum, for example.
Go ahead.
If she was unwell and went to the doctor for something, the doctor's word was gospel. Literally gospel, and that could not be challenged. So even if he or she said something that was harmful, or gave the wrong kind of medication out, or whatever, it didn't matter, because the doctor said it was what she should have, and you couldn't budge her on that at all, could you?
No, the doctor says you have to have your tonsils out.
Yes.
What?
Yes.
Off you go.
Yes.
Here comes the gas.
Yes.
Yeah. And some children died.
They did.
Under tonsillectomies when I was young.
Yeah.
Completely unnecessary operation, unnecessary risk. But the doctor said it.
Yes. So you go along with it.
So you have to.
Yeah. It's one of those, we've talked about it before with respect to the animus, one of those unassailable truths.
Yeah.
It can't be questioned. This is how it is. So therefore, this is how I'm going to act.
Yeah.
And, you know, when a woman gets in that state, that possession state, she gives herself over to it. Yeah. Whether it's your GP or you give it to Jesus Christ, it doesn't really matter. You lose your own inner authority at that point.
Yeah. See it in political movements as well.
Definitely you do, yeah.
So the next question comes from Aetherian, and he asks, what happens when people individuate too quickly? I made amazing and rapid progress after joining the Discord. However, with everything, I see what he did there, put an A in front of the E, like your username. With everything moving so fast, I felt something I can only describe as ego inflation. I'm quite sure it was all genuine and good progress. However, it happened so quick, it became overwhelming. My question then is, what exactly happens from a theory perspective when someone individuates too quickly, and do you have any relevant clinical experience with this? I can give my own 2 cents on my own my own development, but in terms of the actual question, if you've got any theory, that would be great to get out straight away.
Yeah, go ahead, James. Let's hear your theory.
Right. Well. In terms of, I've individuated. We can say, obviously, it's not a complete process, but over the last 2.5 months, it's been incredibly intense. So obviously, you guys have probably seen the "How Jung Saved Me from Dante's Hell" video, where I describe what had gone up to that point. But the idea is not, and this is how some people in the comments interpreted it. I'm now suddenly a wise old man. If you like, I've got all the wisdom and now I know what my true calling is. It's way clearer than it was, but the development keeps going. So the idea with individuation, of course, is becoming who you are. And so the general process from me at this early stage, which will be very similar to lots of other people, is you've got to get rid of all of those introjects from all those other influences, such as traumas, such as your parents, that are stopping you being who you are. The current ways in which you've adapted in a usually maladaptive fashion to who you should be as such. So what from my experience is, it's quite overwhelming, because when you engage with the psyche properly, the psyche will keep throwing things at you. And so for me, for example, my productivity was very difficult to maintain, and it was nowhere near as intense as it was, but it was difficult to maintain because I would get weird psychosomatic transductions, things like that. So people know that I had my dissociation stuff, which was a sign that you've been decapitated. But then I also started to get a really heavy hurting heart for a little while. It was kind of, that was it, a heavy heart. And that kind of threw me off, because I can't sit there and focus because I'm thinking I'm going to die, you know? And so it does kind of, it drains you, I think, as you were saying, Pauline, last time in the Animus podcast, drains you in a good way when you're engaged with something properly. But the advice, for what it's worth, Aetherian, is something you've said to me, Steve, is definitely go at your own pace. And the thing is, if you respect the psyche, it seems to allow you to get away with things a bit more. That you don't have to constantly be individuating day in, day out and go into your cave and resolve all of your complexes. You can get on with normal life, but just keep engaging with the process.
Sometimes normal life won't allow you to do anything, will it? When you think about it, and we talked, I think on the last few podcasts actually, about individuation not happening in a vacuum. Steve, I think, rightly said that you have to start on the inside, and then that's a good thing to do. But ultimately, you have to go out and live it. And sometimes life won't allow you to necessarily rush ahead and do it at the pace that you might like to do it in an intellectual sense. So I think there are just natural breaks on things anyway, over the course of your life, and obviously in terms of lifespan development, as you grow and get older and new challenges present themselves, you're constantly adapting to those experiences as well. So it's not just purely inwardly focused, is it? It's an interactive process as well, and so in that sense it can only really unfold at a particular pace.
I'd agree with all of that. To go back to Epherian's questions, though, the second part was to do with clinical experience.
Yes.
And then the first one, is it possible to individuate?
Well, what exactly happens from a theory perspective when someone individuates too quickly? So obviously the presupposition is people can. Just to if I can, just for the sake of development of a point, to reduce that down to the major premise. The major premise itself is sadly inaccurate, because you cannot individuate too quickly. You can't. If something goes wrong when you are individuating, you haven't individuated.
Yes.
It's a process dynamic that is teleologically driven. In other words, the goal is anticipated at the beginning. Now, because it's released naturally from the genome, from the genomic self, as you're intended to become who you should be, the pace is relatively slow under normal environmental conditions. If you artificially, though, give it a kickstart, which anyone following this path is doing, the pace increases, and that will throw your homeostasis out. Symptoms of your homeostasis being kicked out might be the kind of thing that Epherian is talking about. I would not see that as being the same thing as, for example, an inflation of the ego or ego that occurs in a clinical setting when somebody accesses things that are too big for their personality to hold. That's different. This is someone, knowing Epherian as I do, I've communicated and talked with him directly and personally. I know that this guy has immense potential personally.
Yes, definitely.
And as that potential is launched, it's going to stress his normal capacity to self-regulate, how he's lived his life up until this point. That's entirely something which you can anticipate. And I was aware that would probably happen, but I'm also very aware that his potential is such that he will be able to counter that. And he will be able to articulate the process as he's going through it, and he's just done that. So in essence, he is doing the right thing in the right way. He's showing that he's observing himself developing. He's asking very intelligent questions. He's aware of the trajectory that this will naturally take. So in that sense, I have no real concerns for him, to be quite honest. But I would say it is completely different from a clinical case where somebody becomes inflated by identifying with something that the ego cannot normally contain. But when you do see that, you do get people who either get religiose, as it's called in psychiatry, ideas which possess them. They start to overreach themselves, and then things start to break down. They may go into hypomania, for example, which can have a biological cause, an entirely genetic cause, and it's psychologically. But you get then two phenomena which look the same, but which are actually different. This is where you have to be careful about what you interpret, because someone with a psychiatric background might say of someone who just has a relatively minor ego inflation, they're hypomanic. The next thing you know, they're on lithium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they've acquired themselves a psychiatric label and probably a psychiatric career, which will damage their individuation. But feeling the forces within you wanting to propel you forward, by feeling them consciously and therefore knowing that they're there, you are paradoxically not inflated.
Yes.
You have insight into the process, whereas someone who is truly inflated has no idea at all that there's anything wrong with them, or that they're exceeding their boundaries in terms of what they can healthily maintain as a system. So I wouldn't worry if there was any worry. I don't think there will be. I think he's just asking a very helpful question because he's a very bright lad. And that's helping us to explain some things in answering the question.
Perfect. I'll also add into the mix as well, this might be relevant. The more engaged you are, and it seems like you are, we did very recently, all three of us actually, had a very weird paranormal phenomenon which took place, which was these things do tend to increase, and synchronicities do tend to increase the more engaged you are with the process. This has happened with some of the people that I've been working with on the side to try and help them individuate, either in the Signal group which I run at the Patreon, or in real life. The amount of synchronicities do increase, but the paranormal one we had was incredibly strange. Just to sort of briefly go over it, if it's not gonna upset the gods or anything like that. Suddenly all tech on my end stopped working, all tech on your end stopped working, Steve. This is when we got the shadow integration manual out, and I was inundated with emails from loads and loads of you guys going, the link doesn't work. But the link was working, and it was working with Jane, who has tested it. It worked on your end when it tested it. It worked with other guys in the team who tested it. It just suddenly stopped working. And Jane and I were sitting there in the other room on the bed. I was kind of like, what's going on? Why is all the tech not working? Then we both heard a disembodied voice just speak something really spooky. We both heard it, and there was nowhere it could have happened. And then our dog Flynn went up to the window and started looking out the window and woofing at stuff that wasn't there. It's like, okay, there's something to do with my shadow I'm not taking into effect, and because I'm engaged and I'm going on this path, the psyche's like, wake up, like we were saying sort of like last time. So this stuff does happen.
I did say, I think on the first podcast, that this kind of thing will happen. I predicted it would. Do you remember that, James?
Oh yes.
And it's an index, a really good measure objectively, because it's external to you, a manifest phenomenon, that you are actually stirring up the underworld. And that's a form of homeostasis as well. That's suddenly, you're accelerating out of the blocks, and it creates a drag, like frame dragging around a black hole. For those of you who are familiar with physics, what happens then? You get all sorts of distortions of space-time. And it's like that in psychological space-time, that when somebody starts to move quickly and the incredible mass of the collective unconscious gets articulated, you get these huge tidal forces, and you get disturbances all around you, which we articulate as being synchronicities and paranormal phenomena.
It's all very scary when it happens, but very, very exciting to sort of look back.
It's great though, isn't it? Because, if you're an experimenter and you like to experience real world, then it's good. It's good. It's a bit frustrating when things start to really go bananas, like books fly off shelves and open and things like that, which has happened a lot. And all sorts of weird things like inanimate objects deciding to appear from underneath another one and then do a right angle and roll between your feet. And stuff like that, and poltergeist activity knocking on your front door and weird dreams and stuff, but a lot can happen. It happens in the moment.
It does,
and it's to do with the state of your psyche and anyone else you're connected with, and the more people who are connected with it, the bigger the phenomenon.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, on that kind of scary note, hope that helped Aetherian. And
can I just add one thing?
Of course you can, Pauline. Go for it.
I'm thinking about therapy situations again as well. Is that sometimes you get somebody come in and they actually they're inflated, but not in the right direction. Sometimes people do actually need to be inflated in the right way, in a homeostatic sense.
Good point.
So I don't know the young gentleman concerned. Steve obviously does, and yourself. But sometimes you'll get someone, for example, who has a superiority complex, because so they're behaving in an inferior way, because this is how the theory goes, they're trying to compensate for that. The compensation is opposite, isn't it?
Yes,
to what you would expect, really. So that someone who's got a superiority complex is actually better than how they're presenting themselves, but they're not actually. They act in an inferior way
to compensate for that superiority in front of other people. That's basically, they pull themselves down, just like the inferiority complex overcompensates with superiority.
Yeah. So it's just something to look out for, because it's not necessarily a bad thing to be inflated. Again, it depends on the context.
It does. You can be negatively inflated.
You can, yes.
And that's a clinical feature which Jung talks about, negative inflation.
Yeah.
And with a polarity like inferiority, superiority complexes, which are not reality based in terms of what's best for that person or their environment, sometimes you need to help them shift the energy from one of those poles to the other.
Yes.
They are inflated, as Paul says, but in the wrong direction. So you need to help them to bring some of that energy back, and then that'll overcompensate and then find the balance point, which is in a dynamic equilibrium state that helps maintain their psyche and their social relationships.
So for the next question, this one comes from 69 Conans, which is of course a fantastic name, and he asks, are there any good books or resources on parenting that you would recommend? In short, how do I give my kids the least amount of issues possible?
I think it's impossible not to.
Good point.
And I think if you start with that premise, you're almost going to fail, really, because at the end of the day, you're human. You're a human being before you're a parent. And I don't think, I mean, we look back now, I mean, both of our, kids are pretty much grown up. I don't think we could have done it any better or any differently to what we have done.
But they are what they are.
They are what they are, yes.
And very often what appears to be a neurosis within a family is just somebody trying to abstract themselves out and away in order to be an individual. So you can give someone a too facilitative environment, which their biology forces them to reject in order to leave home and to individuate. So you'll then get, if a family has been given a child unconditional positive regard, we don't believe in that, by the way, but it is a philosophy of sorts as pushed by Carl Rogers' school of therapy.
It creates monsters, doesn't it?
It can create monsters because they have to separate and develop their own identity from that background, and in so doing they overcompensate for what they've been given. And you very often get, like, policemen's sons will be criminals, or priest sons will become whatever, in compensation for the background that they have. I think the best thing you can do is to give as much love as you can from within yourself, according to your own value set, and that's the best you can do. They will individuate away from you, and in a way we should want that. We should want them to be themselves, whatever that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think because obviously we home educated both our kids. Maybe the one thing that actually honed for us was, because we had to obviously provide an education, was to try and make it as bespoke as we could. Which kind of forces you to say, well, what is right for this person, as opposed to what I just maybe want to teach them, that I like myself subjectively. It kind of forced us to think a lot about what was best for them. And even if that meant that they were going to reject us or reject our work or whatever to become themselves, and we had to accept that.
You have to let it happen.
You have to let it happen. So you only really have so much control, I think, over that process.
Fulfill yourself as a parent, in the sense that your own parental instincts will lead the parental archetypes to release themselves appropriately in terms of giving care and love. And then the final part of being the parent is the letting go. Not in a dismissive or cold way. You're still there receptively if they need you, but you will only damage people if you hang on to them too long. So do your best from your heart. I'm sure you'll be fine. There are plenty of books out there. I wouldn't trust most of them.
No, I wouldn't.
To be honest with you.
I mean, we have read a lot of them when the kids were little, but
and we've met a lot of people who specialise in that kind of thing. I would also, and this is purely personal, please don't accept it, my theoretical view separates me from, for example, a lot of the attachment theorists. People like Melanie Klein and the Object Relations School, I think they've been toxic with respect to Jungians. The London School of Jungians, for example, I believe personally have been utterly ruined by them. Lots of other Jungians believe this too, from within the orthodoxy. John Bowlby, who's influenced Anthony Stevens very heavily, did a lot on maternal deprivation. He's famous for it. And he's right as far as it goes in the pathological sense. But where there is no need in an environmental sense for pathology to even arise in the first place, just don't go there. You don't need it. And with people who have been damaged and hurt as children, you can't change the past, but you can change the present.
Yes.
And that's true for adults. You make changes in the present to give people a better future. Going back in, particularly an attachment wound, is not always very positive or productive.
No, it's very regressive.
It's regressive.
It infantilizes.
It does
things.
infantilize people.
Yeah.
Inner child work, for example, was very popular in the 1980s and 1990s. That caused so much harm to people. The only value of a child as a symbol is that it represents potential that can grow up. You do not want to become a child again, or you shouldn't want to become a child again. And you certainly don't want to become a child again in relation to other people who have an adult mindset, which is malevolent towards controlling you.
Yes.
So if you have a child image in a dream, I would say, I know this is prescriptive and in a way going against what I said earlier, the only value of the child is that it will grow up, and you need to grow up too, and you need to move forward.
Yeah, nice. Very definitely.
Nice. Well, obviously I can't add anything to that, to be completely honest. I think that's a very, very good answer. So
well, you have your own experience of your own family, obviously, James. You have that. We all have that. Even as parents, you know, we think back to our own parenting, really.
Yeah.
Even more so than maybe the parenting that we do ourselves.
Yeah, we do. And of course, a lot of damage is done in parental-child relationships. An awful lot of it does start then. But you can't go back in time and fix that wound. By all means, become aware of it.
Yeah.
But you can't go back and fix it in that frame. You have to fix it from where you are now, so you have a different future. And if you have been hurt or abused, do not pass that on.
Yeah.
You have a moral position that you can take by choice to say, it ends here. It ends now. This is not going to be replicated in the generation that follows from me. It won't happen.
That's probably the best you can do, actually,
absolutely,
Steve, isn't it?
Yeah, other than that, give love.
Yes,
give love.
It's back to developing yourself, because at the end of the day, your children are just moving through.
Yes, you don't own them, you don't possess them.
No, you really don't. And I know it's probably controversial, but they don't owe you anything either.
No,
not really.
If you do your own job as well as you can by instinct and by archetype, there is nothing more you can do.
Yeah, I think you should reach a point. I mean, certainly if I think about myself, whereby you're actually grateful for your children moving on, because it allows you to carry on developing yourself for whatever time you have left.
Yes.
And again, that's a gift. It's a gift to be able to say, I have my own world, my own work. I want to carry on with that. I love you, but I let you go. And if you come back and you come back to see us, well, that's a gift back to us that we really appreciate.
That's the positive animus working in a woman. Obviously, everybody's perspective is different.
Yes.
Children will have parental complexes and archetypal expectations and instincts of their parents. If you do the best job you can, everyone will come out relatively unscathed.
Yes, but it'll never be perfect.
Never, no.
For anyone.
No, neurosis is normal.
Yes, yeah.
Well, 69 Conans is a man, of course, and I do know him. I do know you. Yes. So you told me before, relatively recently, Steve, something that really resonated. I've passed it on since, about Edward III and the Black Prince and the role of the role of the father. I think that would be a really cool thing to throw in here, if you don't mind.
Well, that was mentioned in a context, wasn't it? I mean, will it mean anything if I say that out of?
I think so. I think so, in terms of the role of the father. I think knowing 69 Conans, I think this will resonate with him. Yeah,
well, I don't know if he would know the Battle of Poitiers in the 100 Years' War.
Well, it's just, I guess, just medieval battle, I guess, for context.
It was in France anyway. King Edward III, who was a very, very successful warrior king, his son Edward, the Black Prince, was in trouble. He was in serious trouble, could have lost his life. And King Edward III was there with his peers, his companions, and they said, your son is in great danger, you know, he's about to lose his life. And the king said, let the boy win his spurs.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Although he was the prince and he was intended to be the successor to the kingdom, to rescue him would have taken away that rite of passage and transformation where he confirmed his own manhood in front of his father and his father's generation of older men and experienced warriors. And he did win his spurs. Very important thing.
Yeah, it's nice. It resonates with me. I have a feeling it'll resonate with 69 Conans as well. It's just a nice way to sort of cap off the journey of fatherhood, in a way.
Because to win your spurs is to become a knight. Although he was a prince, and obviously socially he was much a higher level than a common knight, even the king and the prince had to be knighted. They had to be knighted. They had to prove themselves. So for him, it was a rite of passage, and he let him do it.
Plus, I think what you're suggesting too about the role of the women in this, that the women, psychologically speaking, have to hand their sons over to their father or fathers in order for that to happen.
Yes.
Because, you know, a mother can raise a son to manhood, but she can't, you know, it takes the father's role, doesn't it?
That's the intermediate role, isn't it? It's the father and the peer group. And then finally it'll be another woman in a relationship that ultimately confirms a man. But to go through that specific part of the hero archetype as a process, remember, it's not an individual thing, it's an entire process. The hero cycle is the archetype, not the hero. To go through that, that's with a peer group, with the older men. And then coming out the other side of that, the acceptance of him as an ordained man, if you like, comes from relationship to a mature adult woman. And that was first confirmed, or should have been confirmed, by the mother. Yeah,
well, there has to be a letting go by the mother for that to happen.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And that's where people get mother complex issues, when the mother hangs on to the boy, who does not allow him to be confirmed, does not allow him to go through the hero cycle, the adolescent transition, and then stops him from being confirmed in a relationship to an adult woman. Who would, of course, replace her. The greatest sin of all for a mother who cannot let go of her son.
Yeah, sweet. I like that. So probably good idea to move on to the next question. This comes from Baldebrock. And Baldebrock asks, it's a fairly long question. I'll set the scene. I'll tell the story. And then we'll see what happens. So Baldebrock asks, imagine a patient who committed a sin more depraved and inelegant than anything you have ever encountered, and consequently developed a psychological disorder severe enough for him to sense the presence of a spiteful and pimply imp, literally. This man is now possessed by a craving for self-immolation, taking the form of self-imposed retribution to punish the imp, though his ego is so utterly disintegrated that this imp is just as conscious or unconscious as his craving for the cross. How does such a lost soul make himself whole? How could you individuate when you yourself have become void of love of life, of a centre, as you are consumed by a struggle between pride and self-loathing, whilst the contents of your personality, manifested in your crimes, are too deplorable for you to attain or accept love from without? Is there anyone beyond hope? And for context, he adds, I'm studying The Possessed by Dostoevsky. I'm obviously not asking for myself.
Taken. No worries. Right, okay. The only people who are beyond hope are psychopaths. Anyone else has hope.
Yes.
A dyed-in-the-wool genetic, 100% nasty, evil psychopath is beyond hope, probably. Yeah. Although there will be a few of them who can be recovered as well, but I am defining it in terms of the absolute outer limit. The extreme psychopath is beyond hope. Personally, working with someone, I have worked with psychopaths. The only people I have great difficulty, and I do actually find it impossible to work with, are paedophiles.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
But the description that he gives is a psychotic episode. The only way you're going to deal with, the only two ways you can deal with that initially are going to be medication, I'm afraid, or it's going to be a containing belief system that can utilize those symbols for transformation. And that will be a religion or a belief system that was powerful enough to work on an equivalent level to a belief system, a religion. That will produce some kind of stability. If you try a long-term in-depth analysis with someone like that, it will be very long-term. It may never end. because the inductive power of those images is so strong. And from what he's suggesting, that this person has a fragmented ego. As I say, that's a psychosis, and such a person would not be in a safe state to be for themselves or for others. And the way that society normally deals with that is incarceration and medication and a psychiatric unit.
Yes.
Black picture, I know, but
Yeah.
he's defined the terms that we work from in terms of conceptualizing what he means by his question. And as far as I understand the question, that's the only kind of bandwidth of answers I can give.
Yes.
Medication until he's stable enough, or a religion or equivalent belief system that can handle and systematize safely the kind of symbols that he's talking about. And there are various belief systems out there that could do that, depending upon the initial conditions and conditioning of the individual.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
sometimes you do. Sorry, Steve. Sometimes you do see this kind of conversion with criminals. If you know, I mean, we actually need to say we know of someone.
We know several actually.
But who found God?
Yeah.
I think you probably know who I'm thinking of.
There's a lot. Oh yeah, him.
Your namesake, yeah. But it's not you.
No, it's not.
No, it's not you.
No.
But he turned to God.
There's a lot who've done that, actually. A lot, and you know the others too.
Yes.
Or some of them, very often with violent psychopaths, right? One of the things that will correct for that is the Christian God, because that's the most accessible version of monotheism that they can access within our culture. And what they find then is a bigger bully than them, which is what they need. And if they can't find a bigger physical bully, a bigger spiritual bully will do the job nicely.
Yeah.
And so when they then turn to God and accept the power of this monotheistic God who could destroy them at a level of the soul, then they calm down. And they use that as a way of containing themselves, and they begin to self-change. So yes, they're violent psychopaths, but they wouldn't be on the extreme end of the spectrum that I'm talking about, or was talking about earlier. But that's a really good example, because some of these guys they're not just alphas, they're alpha plus. Yes. And then raised to the power of 100.
Oh yeah.
These particular people are devastatingly violent and aggressive. The only thing that's been able to contain them is, as I say, a bigger bully, and therefore a bigger super ego than anything that they may have or may not have, may lack in their own nature.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking too about sometimes, and you probably know more about this than I do because of your interest in it. But with Buddhists, for example, sometimes they use the psychopaths, don't they? In a particular way, use their energy up in the community.
Yeah, in Tibetan Buddhist communities, they actually utilize social behaviors which are, not the best, and they use them for police duties and for military, that kind of thing. And they usually wait until they're in the 40s, these people, and then they say, now you can start to learn from the sutras, you can learn Buddhism properly, but you weren't ready to do that before. So they use up the negative energy and then introduce them to the Buddhist texts and scriptures.
But it wouldn't work the other way around.
No, and they know that, and the system self-regulates that way.
Okay. Well, to go back to Balderbot's question quickly, because obviously you're into Dostoevsky, and you have been for a long time, and we've communicated over the Discord about Dostoevsky. I want to kind of give a different angle in a way, because Dostoevsky's obviously received a revival in appreciation and interest thanks to Jordan Peterson coming onto the scene, and the classic thing Peterson talks about is Crime and Punishment, and Crime and Punishment being the main guy, Raskolnikov, he becomes too intellectual and he takes away God. It's like Nietzsche's death of God, and then over the course of the book he goes slowly mad because he realizes that there's essentially an inbuilt psychic law to do with morality that you can't just suppress with thoughts. And it's like, okay, great. But I've never actually seen a discussion of the ending of the book, for example, and it's kind of similar to the way Dante's true meaning is not really discussed. So the ending of Crime and Punishment is very true, for example. And I know you're not talking about Raskolnikov in this situation, you're talking about the possessed, but it's kind of another way to illustrate it. Raskolnikov goes through the book and he is slowly losing his mind. But at the end, he meets this, I think she's called Sonia, this Sonia character, who is a Christian. And Sonia is the one who actually redeems him. in a way. So there is, throughout all of Dostoevsky, because he was a Christian, there is this arc of redemption, because he was obviously staring into the, in a kind of precognitive way, the shadow of Russia and communism coming up forwards. He was looking for redemption. So exactly as you two have described, in terms of God being the containing vessel for the evil, that's basically what Dostoevsky was going on about. But in Crime and Punishment, it's not God. Raskolnikov doesn't turn to God, he turns to Sonia. And that's kind of the point. The anima is the thing which actually revives him, and she's kind of like this frail, sickly thing that's sitting in a tower somewhere, and she's hanging out there. And there's an appendix or an epilogue to the book where he's in a work camp or something, but Sonia keeps visiting him to keep giving him hope and hope and hope. So it's not God in this particular case. It was actually the anima, exactly the same way as Dante. It's almost a way to be like...
I just have to, because I don't know the story that well, is she transformed? You say, is she kind of, you seem to be describing as being almost crippled in some way. I don't know if that's accurate.
Yes, so she's described as being very sickly, incredibly nervous, you know, and then she finds her redemption through Raskolnikov, and Raskolnikov finds his redemption through her. But it's a subtext to the book, because it's covered with a lot of philosophy and a lot of Christianity. The subtext, though, is she was the redemption and vice versa.
Yeah, well, that's the proper role of the anima, but it also describes the relationship of Christianity to the feminine as well. It's reduced largely to a subtext, unless it's Gnosticism.
Yes.
So there's an element there as well, perhaps, to look at some point.
Yeah, so it definitely creeps in. So it's just personal advice. Do not know if this is actually your case, Balderbrock, but if you're staring into the shadows of the possessed or Dostoevsky, maybe look around it and see what's really going on. Look at Dostoevsky as a character, look at the context in which it was in. Because if he is just describing psychosis, it's not particularly, you know, for you and your own personal development, independent of any kind of value judgment, it's not the most useful thing. Maybe the most useful thing would be looking to see how the characters do find their own redemption. That might be why you're attracted to these particular things, and it could be hidden within it as this form of subtext. I don't know, though, just a general aside.
Yes, very good point.
Very good point, James.
Yeah.
Thank you. So moving on to Simond, or Simond, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name, and he asks, are there any sources you could recommend regarding Jungian approaches to governance? Whilst there are Vedic writings on dharmic governance, and writings from people like Evola, and even some Hegelians on forms of mythic governance, are there any specifically Jungian writings to draw from?
Okay, two levels there, perhaps, and I may not have understood the question. I apologise to him if that's the case. Purely at a superficial level about governance and politics, Jung himself did stand for election and failed. I don't know if that's generally known, but you can find it in any decent biography of Jung, and I think it was a good thing, because had he given way to the power principle in himself, he would have sabotaged his own individuation. But notice he did still do it, still did go towards it. Governance, does he mean on a cultural level and some kind of organising principle that works through cultures?
Yes, I think that's the idea. Yeah,
it does mean that. Jung writes a lot about that. I would recommend Civilization and Transition, which I think is Collected Works 10. I'll just check, excuse me.
Yeah, I think it is.
Where are we?
Can you see everything?
See through your big pile of books.
Psychology and Religion, West and East. There we go.
I think it's 10 or 11, something like that.
Volume 10.
10.
Yeah, I'd recommend that. Get to grips with it at that level. Once this is resolved in terms of seeing what his thoughts and feelings are, come back from that and look at the context within which we're all flourishing or not flourishing at the moment. That will probably help to balance things out. But yeah, I would look at Civilization and Transition. Oh, and also the paper Jung Diagnoses the Dictators. Radio interviews where he discusses Mussolini, Hitler and Stalin as well, because that's governance too. That illustrates the rise of fascism and communism and their collision essentially in the European continent, and how that would spread out over the world. And this was an American journalist who was very probably a CIA agent, because Jung himself was a CIA agent. That's only recently been revealed and confirmed by the CIA in America. It was a precursor to the Second World War and a psychological angle on what was going on, but it was something that was allowed to come out, whereas most of Jung's work for the CIA remained secret. His psychological analysis of these political figures and leaders. Hope that helps anyway.
Perfect.
Understood your question, please ask again.
Yes.
Or send me something on the Discord. I'll be more than happy to help if I can. Thank you.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. Well, Simon also asks a follow-up question, kind of similar, but kind of different. And he asks, World War I was the event that heralded the end of the long 19th century and the puerile hopes of eternal liberal progress that the Anglophone cultures particularly held on to. This almost ending of weak progressive history could be considered to be similar to the situation today, where the modern left liberal progress narrative and its own puerile hopes are coming to an end. In terms of things missing today that were present during the Edwardian period, what might then be rediscovered as resonant within an exploration of World War I? Well, where does one start? Duty, discipline, courage, family, nation? The list is long.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, but can we abstract the question out from that? Because I actually agree with the statements in broad terms that it's certainly illustrating a compensation for what's going on now. And as I think has been discussed on the Discord channel, there's a lot of interest in the First World War coming out in movies and in popular culture at the moment. And you have obviously a hero cycle working itself through for younger men there in absolutely perfect form. But also the idea of senseless sacrifice and manipulation by other people, by older generations and so forth. And it was the end of an era. Without a doubt, even more so than the Second World War. Lots of good things came out from the Second World War, lots of bad things too. And you can consider World War I and World War II to be a continuum that had a little break in between of 19 years before, the second half kicked off. But yeah, Britain had an empire, good or bad, whatever you may think of that, and you can argue either way about that. But there was certainly a national identity that was firmly in place across the West. And there was a very definite role for young men, which is missing now. Yes. And it's deliberately been taken away as well. I don't think there's any doubt about that. No. So there will be an archetypal compensation arising, and we're probably just seeing that beginning to surface now above the water, but there's a lot more beneath that too. And there will eventually be a cultural enantiodromia. There will be a reversal. And the present political zeitgeist will go, I hope, in the lifetime of you young people.
Yes.
Yeah. Because it is awful. It's catabolic. It's destructive. It will pass. I hope soon.
Well, we can remember, even with respect to our own son, growing up, those ideas that little boys shouldn't play with guns, for example. I mean, that's happened in his lifetime. He's grown up with that.
Yeah, it was taken off.
It was.
Yeah. Okay.
When I was growing up, it was normal. Every little boy was a proto-soldier, and it was expected that you would be. My father and his generation, Second World War, my grandfather's, both of them, First World War, and that was what was passed down. It was that expectation that you would follow suit. But something changed. Something changed in the late 1960s through the hippies and the age of Aquarius and all of that, which was really a false start. And we're living with that now, I think, to some extent. Yes. It's obviously not a good thing to go into a militaristic society that exports destruction and death all over the place, but we don't have to go in the opposite direction to the extent that we have, where men are being neutered en masse culturally and psychologically.
At least it could have been healthily expressed then through fantasy, which of course is what it was.
Yes.
It was innocent, wasn't it? It was innocent enough. And like you say, if you repress these things, it goes somewhere else.
They do. They do indeed.
Yeah, when I was growing up, it's interesting because I'm 23, so probably the same age or roughly the same as your son. And that was never a thing in terms of boys can't play with guns. It was very much, we come from a small town in Surrey, England, and I used to play around with guns all the time. The finger guns, bang, bang, bang. Yes. It was only like.
Then you.
Well, children are being sent home from school even recently, weren't they, for doing that? Female teachers would send boys home. They would be excluded from school because they did what you just said.
Yes.
And so it didn't happen when I was a kid, but when I was like older in sixth form or something, these things would go on. And around the time I was not switched on politically at all. I was like, that's kind of a bit weird, Why is that going on? But my antidote has always been, do it anyway. You know, obviously you're asking the question, Simon. I imagine you're not a 7-year-old who wants to go bang bang with your finger guns. But
Yes.
but if the environment is like you can't be a masculine man, I say screw it, basically.
Well, you're less likely to become a violent psychopath if you can do those sorts of things in a harmless way.
Yeah, I guess so.
Depression always bites
it does.
back.
It has to come back in some form.
It will.
And bite you on the backside.
At the moment, we have a particularly oppressive police force in the UK.
Yeah.
And I say that as someone who has served in the police. And I know that it wasn't perfect in my day. It was far from it. There was corruption. There was violence. Now it is sick.
Yes.
It is seriously sick. And it reflects the culture that we're living in. And I don't mean the individual people, the young people, the up-and-coming generation. I mean the people who are holding the power. The people who are holding the power, who are in early to middle age, early middle age to middle age, they are sick. They are seriously sick. This culture is sick. And it's really down to you lads and lasses to do something about it. I hope you do, for the sake of everyone.
Yeah.
Well, I guess myself, Simon, and all the Jung To Live By lads and lasses, of course, that's our new calling. We'll be sure to do that. Don't worry, we have it under control. The penultimate question then comes from Based Magus, and he asks, what is the correct course of action when the images and narratives that have heavy resonance seem to be distant from any understandable archetype? There are many cases of individuals who face mythic structures mirroring Arthurian myth, ancient Greco-Roman narratives, and the like. What then must be done when the archetypes that manifest are decidedly alien? For example, drawing more from ideas such as Lovecraft or Burroughs. What do you think?
Okay, I think we have to. That's a really good question. Thank you for that. I think we have to distinguish, of course, between an archetypal image and the archetype in itself, but we need to make a further adjustment to that and think very, very much in local terms about what's going on in our own culture and why certain representations, collective representations, are being made. That's a big thing all on its own. The other thing is that collective myths are not personal myths. A collective myth, even if it's Arthurian, for example, may help you to access your personal myth, but it's just as likely to conceal it because it's distracting on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is so charged with symbolism that if you over-identify with it, you will lose yourself. So a collective myth is not a personal myth. And this is something that I'd like with Pauline and with James to work through over forthcoming podcasts. To get to the axis of your own timeline, you have to work through and around all the things that have gathered around it. So if you have a myth, a collective one, which is resonating with you, it's because either it's distracting you or it's trying to get you to get to your core essential self. That's a job all of its own. If you get something which is false and fake and it's being imposed or you're not resonating with, that's either worse or it's a good thing because you're not being distracted by fake narratives, fake cultural narratives. You would then hopefully fall back on yourself more by saying, I'm not going to engage with any of this. I'm going to go in. I'm going to find out what my real personal myth is. Yeah. I'm going to access my own self. And then the psyche will give you what you need to understand because you're making the effort to go in and to ignore things. Because, for example, if you engage with anything, I'll say Game of Thrones, and I've got nothing against Game of Thrones.
That was in my mind strangely.
Because it's an obvious one. You engage with Game of Thrones as some kind of illustrative personal mythology. Well, it's not personal, it's collective. So yeah, use it, bounce off it, go back in yourself. But if that's being used to sell a political message to you, a message of control, and you internalize it, then that's damaging. So discrimination is very, very important. Stand outside the times within which you live. Look back, but also look forward. Then you get a proper perspective. To do that, though, you need to get hold of your own Ariadne thread, the thing that has led from your beginning and will take you out the other end of life as well. If you get hold of that, you're not going to go far wrong. But be very, very careful of people who would impose and dictate what narratives, mythic narratives, that you should resonate with. So I would regard it as an opportunity, if things are not resonating with you, to disengage from that and to go in and to find yourself.
There's a proliferation of fantasy out there, isn't there?
Yeah.
at the moment.
Yeah.
Huge amount of it.
And I would say that that's the same as a soap opera. At that point, these mythic narratives are actually being reduced to the level of a soap opera. That they're just inductive forms, hypnotic forms of representation that don't really give you anything other than a distraction from yourself.
Steve, do you think a lot of young men are engaging in that, though, because they feel disenfranchised?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. They're all looking for something.
Yeah.
But even if you go back to Arthur, what version of him? Sir Thomas Malory's?
Well, yeah.
Which is the popular one. That's not the original, and it's not the only. There were medieval versions which are not contained within Thomas Malory. Gawain and the Green Knight is not within Sir Thomas Malory's canon. It stands outside of it. But it's possibly far more valuable than almost anything you're going to get out of Sir Thomas Malory in and of itself.
Yes.
So be really, really careful about what you take in.
It's far more instructive, isn't it?
Yeah. A collective myth, I can't say it too many times, a collective myth is not a personal myth. And if you're feeling a separation, I think that's a good thing. I really do. Yes.
Yeah, well, this stuff, it does hit close to home based on my own development. I was very, very attached to the idea of the knight. Before I understood Jung properly, or in the way that I currently do, very attached to the idea of the knight. And I was like, I am a knight. I am a knight. And of course, the Jung To Live By audience, you guys will know this, but in case it's your first video, I just kind of want to stress to echo what Steve was saying there. You're not the warrior archetype. You're not the magician archetype. You aren't, in this particular case, not saying you are base mages, but you're not the guy who kills the Lovecraftian gods. They're all separate images, and if they will draw you in. So you say you've got the whole suite of all of the images. Certain ones will appeal to you for certain personal reasons. But these are images created by somebody else or from the collective unconscious in general as dialectic communications with the ego. And it's like, well, okay, why are they resonating with me? That's the point. And they could be for a good reason, as you were saying, or with me in particular, there was a strong complex part of that. It's based on my own personal myth and removing introjects from other things which I had experienced in the past.
That's a good insight.
Very good.
Very good. Really, really good insight that you've identified it as a complex, which is masquerading as an archetype.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they can, and they do, and they will. You know, it's really, really important. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to that is a really, really good discrimination that you've made there. A very effective and helpful one.
Thank you, and I hope it's helpful to other people watching, because there is a lot of disinformation, especially I am the warrior archetype is the most common one. It comes from King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which is it's a fun book, a pointless book. I'm just going to say throw it away. It's not going to help you with anything.
You'd be a lot of people, wouldn't you, if you were? Because even Joseph Campbell said you'd have 1,000 faces.
Yeah, very, very true.
Just try wearing the one that you've got. Live with it. Get out there and self-actualize. Don't around trying to be
everything else is an illusion, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
That you create through fantasy. That you're actually able to manipulate these worlds, these fantastical worlds, but they're just taking you further and further away from yourself. And who you're meant to be.
The neurotic alibis. They're guiding fictions. They're not real.
Brilliant. I like that, bringing it back to the personal myth. I like that. But I guess time to move on to the very final question. This one comes from Nick D. Now, Nick, I have edited your question slightly, but the meaning is still there. Basically, he asks, is sexuality related to the anima or the animus?
Right. Shall I? Or
you can kick off if you want. It tends to obscure it, doesn't it? That tends to be our position on it. Sorry, I've spoken for.
You can kick off, but I'm sales.
Go on, I'll let you.
There is the assertive animus, and rightly so as well. Yeah. If I were to paraphrase Bill Clinton, dare I do this?
No.
Instead of saying it's the economy, stupid, right? It's the relating factor, stupid, and I don't mean you.
It's not personal.
No, not at all. It's just a handy way of saying to yourself, just wake up and remember, it is not about sexuality, it's about relating. Relating involves sexuality, but sexuality can be independent of relating.
Yes.
You can have sex with people, not relate to them at all. This is one of the issues with toxic masculinity. But relating starts instantly that you're born with your primary caregiver, and it characterizes everything until, if you're unfortunate enough that something like dementia sets in, and you can't even relate to yourself anymore, right? But from beginning to that, the relating factor is everything. Now, the anima is not a single thing, right? It's projected out, and we call it the anima in a man, but it's just a relating function.
Yes.
We could have called it anything.
Yes.
and it can go to any object, any situation, any belief system that you interact and relate with, that mobilizes that force and that drive within you. Usually it's transferred onto women when you're a man, and when you're a woman, usually it's transferred onto men, but it's not that. Sexuality is definitely a part of relating, and it's therefore definitely connected to the anima, but they are not the same thing. Very, very important to make that distinction.
Okay. Well, maybe in the future, eventually down the line, we'll tackle more of because it's obviously a thing, and I understand the curiosity around it. Completely valid question. Yes. Jung did, in fact, he actually did it in Ion as well, but he did it in other places where he gave an explanation for, say, homosexuality based in the anima and the animus. So obviously there will be a lot of intrigue in there. Maybe we can tackle it in the future. Yeah. But I definitely agree with what you're saying, Steve.
I would agree with you that does need to be tackled, and one thing you need to understand, everybody needs to appreciate about Carl Jung, is that Carl Jung's collected works are the worked through exposition of his own personal myth. And what you're seeing there is his psyche, his adaptations, his maladaptations, and his journey.
Yes.
And he didn't want to revise anything he'd written, even though he knew that later on he did revise it himself. He wouldn't go back and change things he said in 1912, in 1950. Yeah. He let them stand. He let them stand for a reason, because it shows the development of his thinking. The attitude towards homosexuality at that time produced that kind of response. I'm not saying that we know better now, but we know differently.
Yeah.
And if you insist on sexualizing the anima, and paradoxically Jung said that you shouldn't, then you're going to get that kind of thing emerging. I've worked with plenty of gay people of both sexes. Many who have been through trauma pushed into that situation, some of them by direct sexual and psychological abuse from their mother, being forced as adults to sleep and have sex with their mother, for example. I've seen that so many times, and that appears to have produced homosexuality. With young girls who've been indecently exposed to by their father, or penetrated orally by their father as children, who have then turned into lesbians, they believe. But when you work with them in depth, you're in a completely different world. And even the trauma, the image of the trauma changes. Traumatic images are dynamic things, and they sit at a level of awareness, and they can sit in you somatically, and they can hurt and destroy you. But you can transcend them. It is possible. And it's that I'm interested in a therapeutic sense, to see how people deal with that. And when you get down to the level where that can be dealt with, what we think applies no longer applies. Everything changes, and that's really where we should go in future podcasts, to help people to understand the true meaning of archetypes rather than their manifest appearance, which is symbols in a social sense. And very often they're not symbols, they're signs, because they're consciously constructed and manipulated, which is not the definition of a symbol for Carl Jung.
Yeah, perfect. And on that note, I guess we should close up. So, first of all, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the questions. I apologise if I didn't answer them properly. If you're on the Discord, let me know, and I'll see what I can do. But apologies in advance.
No, brilliant. I'm sure you did an absolutely fantastic job from my point of view anyway. But on that note, if you'd like to join the Discord, you can do so through the Patreon link in the description. And if you'd like to join in with this podcast, it happens once a month. Sometimes we seem to have done a bonus episode so far in the first month. If you sign up at the $10 tier or higher, then you get to join one of these 9 individuals, something like that, and ask a question. Of course, there are other things on there as well, such as a chat with Steve and Pauline, or a chat with me, joining the inner circle. It's all there. Go check it out. It's good stuff. And of course, if you want a link to a free download link to the Shadow Integration Manual, which is something Steve and I wrote, mostly Steve, of course, because you've got the experience, then a link to download that will be in the description down below. Completely free, no strings attached. The stuff is important, and we'd like to give it to you. So, on that note, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Pauline. We will see you again real soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.